Guys, what's the deal with the Spindle Horse team and women? I mean, not to put on my fedora and my soy latte and my thigh-high socks and my this is what a feminist looks like t-shirt to the hell of a boss function or anything. But I'm not the only one who's noticed that Viv's treatment of her female characters spanning across both of her most recent shows is, well, a little weird. There's enough that could be said about sexism bias in writing generally. Enough that I might make a whole nother video exclusively about that. But as it relates to Vivzy Pop, this video is about Millie. If you've been following Hell of a Boss drama for any length of time, you'll know that the most common complaint people give about Millie is that she's one of many female characters who have essentially no character, and that she in particular seems to have no personality trait except for her husband. I hope I don't have to explain that that concept is pretty sexist. Definitely does not pass the Bechdel test. Before I continue, I'd like to clarify that I will not be calling Viv herself, or by extension the Spindlehorse team, misogynist or sexist, because frankly, I just don't see why I would need to. No one who's calling Viv a sexist knows her personally enough to know if that's true, and even if they did, what good would it do? Sure, calling Viv a sexist, or maybe even knowing that Viv is a sexist, may give some context as to what caused this unfortunate development, but what I feel it really does is assign malice to her intentions, which aren't constructive. Put yourself in Viv's shoes for a second. You slave away making this dumb cartoon. It's 3:36 a.m. You look up from your computer, eyes bloodshot red, eye bags sagging underneath your eyes. You open up your Twitter inbox looking for a little bit of relief. How stupid, who does that? And the first thing you see is hordes of 14-year-olds telling you to kill yourself because you're a raging sexist. Let's not even mention the fact that calling people sexists or racists or bigots usually doesn't convince them of that and just makes them indignant. But even if Viv were to magically be like, well, maybe I am a sexist, then what? Where does she go from there? How does one stop being a sexist? At what point in not being a sexist will you become good enough to write? And what does not being a sexist look like in a practical sense? Maybe she is a sexist, maybe she isn't a sexist. Either way, I think it's a redundant piece of criticism, and I don't think it's constructive. I think there are better ways to help writers in this regard. And, I just generally think that this show can stand perfectly well on its own. I don't feel the need to drag in the author's personal life into it. I think that it can speak for itself. So what's a more productive way to look at and criticize Millie? The first and most important thing to note is that Millie isn't just some background character. She's an integral part of the main cast. So integral that when I first watched the pilot in the first handful of episodes, I assumed that Blitz, Moxie, and Millie were the three main characters, and that all of the other characters were side characters. So pretty important. At the very least, optically, it looks like Millie's important, even if she isn't. This makes her subsequent complete lack of a character not only boring and bad in general, but also obvious, which is bad. In an attempt to demonstrate this, though, I feel people have wrongly oversimplified what her real problem is. People say that Millie's only character trait is that she's Moxie's wife, and that's just blatantly not true. Millie likes blunt force objects and violence. She's a country girl with a big family and a lot of siblings who she loves and who loves her. We even get to meet her parents in this episode, both of whom are an integral part of this episode, both of whom have speaking roles. Her parents are hard on her and her husband because they uphold a traditional view of masculinity, which could explain some of why Millie is like that. She has a lot of siblings, some of whom we know by name, and have actual speaking roles. We actually know so much about her that before this episode comes out, we actually know more about her than we do about Moxie. Her husband, people usually complain about having much more depth than her. Let's keep in mind that criticisms about Millie started way before this episode came out. In fact, one day after this episode came out, Viv posted a tweet thread which correctly points this out. Millie's episodes are coming, but I do feel that some ignore the character we are giving her in episodes where she isn't the sole focus. She is resourceful, she has strong family ties and memories, she has a past of violence, she has sibling rivalry, she is excitable and hyper-focused. Ignoring the fact that the way this tweet thread is typed makes it sound stupid, almost like she's self sabotaging her own argument, Viv is, in essence, correct here. Of course, after this episode drops, it's practically over for Millie. She's bodied by how much information we have on her husband. But trust me when I say that even if this episode had never come out, Moxie would still have infinitely more character than Millie. That's including Unhappy Campers and the Ghost episode and the shorts. So, why is that? I don't want to just hate Millie or Hell of a Boss or Viv or Spindlehorse or anything that's related to Millie. A lot of people do, but what I really want to do is understand Millie. I want to know how to be better than Millie. I want to know how to improve this concept. So, why is this the case? Fundamentally, it boils down to one word: conflict. Say you turn on a random episode of Tom and Jerry. It's extremely likely that by the time you finish the episode, you won't have learned almost anything about Tom or Jerry. Of course, there's some lore, like Tom and Jerry usually live in the same house, they usually have the same owners, sometimes they have friends, sometimes they have parents, but most episodes are just about these two. Hell, in this episode I remember watching as a kid, Tom and Jerry aren't even at their regular house. They're at a billiard hall. How did they even get here? But when you watch Tom and Jerry, you don't watch to get an in-depth summary of their likes, their dislikes, their relationship with their parents, their tragic anime backstory, their political views, their life aspiration, or anything else that's typically considered when you're writing a character. You're watching two anthropomorphic animals fight each other in goofy and snarky ways for a couple minutes. I mean, Christ's sakes, they don't even have spoken lines. This is like bottom of the barrel characterization. It really can't get much lower than this. And yet, I've never heard anyone say that Tom and Jerry aren't proper characters or don't have proper characterization. I mean, that might just be because it came out 80 years ago, but I certainly wouldn't. That's despite the fact that I haven't actually seen a clip of Tom and Jerry aside from the 3-minute clip I just used to get content for this video in probably over a decade. I actively rewatched Hell of a Boss like a month ago. This is because Tom and Jerry have conflict. They have so much conflict that their conflict is quite literally the premise of the show. I mean, the show's literally named after them. You don't need to know their backstory or their internal motivations or anything else about them to know what kinds of people they are just from watching how they interact with each other by observing their conflict. Just by watching, we learn that Tom likes to pick on Jerry and that he can get ahead of himself while doing it. We learn that Jerry's quick to temper, and he's smart, and he can outwit Tom. This is how you write characters in a cartoon. To use an analogy, a story is kind of like a machine, and each character is a different cog in that machine. Every cog must be important, but a single cog, or a series of cogs which run on their own, are individually useless. Remember, it's the interactions these gears have with one another, the friction they produce against one another, which churn out the content used in these stories. If no characters had conflict, if Tom and Jerry just had tea every week and played cards instead of fight, there would be no show. If Tom didn't exist, there would be no show. They need conflict in order to have a show. And to give credit where it's due, this is essentially what Viv has successfully done with Moxie and Blitz. Blitz is this arrogant, loud, aggressive guy who sees everything his way and his way only. He's good at talking around and navigating the conversation, and he can be a little mean and impulsive. This puts him at odds with Moxie, who likes things to be more orderly and structured. He's more book smart, less street smart, and he's constantly calling Blitz into question for that reason. Probably the best example of this are the respective hallucination scenes in Truth Seekers, the 6th episode of the first season. You see that for the whole episode before these scenes take place, the characters are having intense conflict. When the hallucinations take place, we see each side of that conflict from the respective character's perspective. Moxie's scene is animated like old Disney and is sung like a musical because Moxie sees himself as an intellectual, directly contrasted to Blitz, who's dirty with mud and grime, who's dressed in a crude clown outfit to reflect seeing himself as a joke. In Moxie's scene, we see him cuss Blitz out, insisting he's a bad boss, because his poor judgment has gotten them in this precarious situation. To contrast, in Blitz's scene, Blitz sees Moxie as phasing in and out of a cartoon drawing of him and his real self, seeing him as nagging while he's going through so much. This is excellent storytelling. It's not just beautifully made, it's also geniusly considered. We get to see the conflict they have with each other in a significantly more personal way, leading us to understand the characters better. Other people have pointed out how odd it is that these scenes have no reference to Moxie's past, and they're right in the sense that it doesn't really make any sense for something so traumatic to not have come up at a time like this, which Viv should have definitely been smarter about. But the point is, without taking into account this future contradiction, this episode is brilliantly executed and beautifully considered. There's a reason we all ate this up after it first came out. It's this conflict that Moxie has with Blitz, not just coming to a head here in this episode, but also bubbling up in every previous episode that gives Moxie his character. Not random bits of information, not anime tragic backstory, but conflict. So it might be obvious at this point that the problem with Millie is not that she doesn't have a character. Oh, no. She has a character. Millie gets thrown essentially any old characteristic or quality or like or dislike Viv can think of in her way to create her yaoi fanfiction. But it fundamentally doesn't work because these don't exist for any purpose. The reason she feels bland is because she has all these traits, but she doesn't really contribute enough emotionally to the story or the growth of the other characters or of herself, which just make her feel like she's kind of pointlessly tagging along. There are actually several kinds of conflict. Personally, I learned about it in 8th grade English class. Just Google kinds of conflict in a story and yup, I was shown at least one of these. Now, I'm not your mom, I can't tell you what to do, but if you're interested, you should give it a look through. I'll simplify it for general audiences here. The two most general kinds of conflict are internal conflict and external conflict. Internal conflict is what we talked about in the Tom and Jerry episode. It's necessary for comedies which require conflict to make jokes, but it's also the most basic form of storytelling and it's used in most gateway shonen anime and kids cartoons. Internal conflict is less commonly used as like a primary focus, but is almost always the backdrop behind the external conflict in dramatic stories. Internal conflict is a conflict a person has with themselves, deciding between two options, struggling with low self-esteem. If you've ever watched a cartoon where an angel and a devil appear on someone's shoulders, that's an attempt to depict inner conflict. This is important because every external conflict is predicated on understanding an internal conflict. All people have reasons for doing the things that they do. You may not agree with those reasons, and I won't ask you to, but essentially no one acts evil to be evil. Yes, even these guys. Understanding that is also critical to write, because giving your characters reasonable motivations and internal reasonings for acting the way that they do is critical for giving them depth and for crafting their future external responses. Think back to a time that you did something that you're not proud of. Ask yourself with genuine curiosity, why did I do that? You probably did it at the time because you thought it was the right thing to do, even if you were extremely misguided in that notion. Why were you misguided? Were you raised to behave or believe differently? Was there something about you which simply made you not care? Why did you do the thing that you did? Understanding the internal conflicts and internal motivations behind characters isn't necessarily necessary, but it helps give characters depth. It helps tie the external conflict together in a way that makes sense, and overall it just makes them feel like real people. But both are necessary in order to create a good story. If you have a good understanding of the internal conflict of two characters, but you don't execute their external conflict well, or in a way that makes sense, you've also got a failure of a show. Now that I think about it, I think Stolitz is actually a good example of that, which I may or may not already have a video on, which you should go check out. But that's a tangent for another day. It's abundantly obvious that Millie possesses neither conflict that's typically considered when you're working on a story. She has traits. She's resourceful, she's strong, she's a good fighter, hyper-focused. In other words, she's very useful plot convenience. Every episode that needs a big, strong person to come in and save the day, it's her, because she is that very big, strong person. And sometimes they give her stuff related to the plot at hand, but only ever as a way to drive the plot forward, like to give exposition about stuff, never as real tension between the characters. And also never to her own end. It's always for the sake of building up the internal or external conflict of another character, never for her own, which I'll get into. These two types of character are not nearly enough when creating a character, especially not to general audiences. I don't want to imply you always have to consider these factors when writing. I know that I certainly don't, especially when I'm just starting out. If you want to just write for fun or for self-serving purposes, that's perfectly fine. Not every work needs to be perfect. Your 24K word My Hero Academia fanfiction doesn't need to perfectly consider every intricacy of character growth and importance and conflict and whatever nonsense. And that's not just me being passive aggressive or rude. I unironically love and enjoy hedonistic fanfiction. I'll never pretend I haven't written self-serving trash that would bring shame to 12-ounce mouths. Those works are actually some of my favorites. But there's a massive difference between producing content for a niche group of people with niche interests, which I endorse and adore, and producing content for general audiences. You need to have some sort of sense of rhythm, of balance, of knowing what you're doing and making competent, well-reasoned decisions in order to write to the general public. For a character with this much visibility, Millie does not have nearly enough consistent conflict with other characters. Unlike Moxie and Blitz, who have an argument or a spat at least once per episode, I can't think of a conflict Millie has which stretches an even a similar length of time. In some episodes, Millie doesn't even really have a conversation that goes back and forth more than once with anyone who isn't her husband. It seems that Viv has been extremely receptive to this criticism. And by that, of course, I mean that she pumped out this tweet thread and gave her 2 episodes of minor relevance in season 2. But hey, that's better than nothing, so for the sake of fairness, I'm going to review them both. Starting off with Season 2, Episode 5, or Unhappy Campers, this is the first real attempt at Millie characterization, which they decide to start with a bang with an argument between her and her husband. I actually like this idea. I think it's pretty smart. We know that Moxie is the character with the strongest bond with Millie, and so it makes it easier on behalf of the writing team to use him as a sort of Trojan horse into some conflict. This is especially true because Moxie already has his own pretty rich internal conflict, so jumping off of his back would be less difficult than inventing another kind of conflict, like out of thin air for her. But enough yapping, let's look at what the conflict's really about.
They want me to perform on stage tonight for the local news. Those videos have made me some kind of human celebrity.
All week it's been, oh, look at Millard. Isn't he great? Oh, look how talented Millard is. We have a job to do, and you're off dancing for views. Why does it matter so much how these yokels feel about you?
I think this is pretty good so far. Like I said earlier, it jumps off the back of Moxie to give Millie a chance to be important. I think this is a great setup. Knowing what we know about Millie, namely that she doesn't come from trauma and that she's a country girl, I would reasonably expect her to say something like, "What are you talking about? Are you kidding? You are the one who suggested it. Don't dare drag me into your mess just because you want it to be liked. That's not my problem." Just add a southern accent in there, and yeah, that's about how I'd expect someone with her general upbringing, personality, and lack of trauma to respond. But instead, she says this.
It doesn't. It matters how I feel about myself. And for once, I feel like I'm important. Like I'm somebody to be proud of.
What? First of all, it matters how I feel about myself? I mean, sure. But since when has Millie had such poor self-esteem she feels the need to compensate with the public's opinion of her? We've never seen that before. She feels like she's important for once? Is this supposed to imply that Moxie makes her feel unimportant? Or is this about her job? Why would she feel unimportant in her job? I swear she's been the only thing keeping them from certain death several times over. Remember what I said about how internal conflict gives meaning to external conflict? Yeah, well, that only works if the conflict has already been established. We have no idea why she's acting this way, and we won't. I'd actually argue that this could have been really effective if Viv was more self-aware about how out of nowhere this seemed to come. Self-awareness can get you really far as a writer. Have Moxie seem really shocked and be like, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know that you felt this way. And Millie, now embarrassed, runs off. This will make it seem like she always has problems, but she just does her best to hide them. That's why we haven't seen them in season 1. It's a little cheap, and I'm sure that a lot of people will catch on to that, but it's better than nothing. Now, this part is crucial. Have us follow Millie into the forest while she's trying to collect herself, and have us see why she believes this, aka a light into her internal conflict. Maybe her parents were extremely demeaning, or maybe they were neglectful considering how many siblings she has. Maybe she's never been loved this way because she's always been humbled by her circumstances. All of them would make sense. Have her eventually come to her senses, have her apologize to Moxie, at which point he apologizes, and have them have that nice scene where he tells her to knock him dead. That scene I just made up works really well because it's aware of how out of character this is for Millie. Not just for us as the audience, but for everyone laying witness to it, including Moxie. And then takes the appropriate means to explain it and give it purpose. But because Viv didn't do that, we're just left bewildered, jaw on the floor, eyes bugging out of our sockets, asking, what did we just watch? Comparing this to Truth Seekers, we see how bad this is by comparison. In Truth Seekers, we literally got into each of the characters' psyche to fully understand the conflict that's been bubbling since the pilot. The fact that we know what they're talking about makes this scene cathartic and gripping to view. We understand each character's internal conflict better, and we get a resolution to their external conflict too. We've never seen this internal conflict on Millie's part, and it doesn't even make intuitive sense. I might understand if she said something like, no one ever listens to me, which could make intuitive sense because we don't really hear her opinion very often. But instead it's about someone to be proud of, it's about feeling valuable. Genuinely, I can't recall a single time anyone's ever treated Millie poorly. I can only vaguely recall Luna calling her an old lady once, and it's my impression of Millie that she wouldn't take it that seriously. Okay, well, bad episode. No one liked this one. Next, slightly better improvement, but still bad for different reasons, is Season 2, Episode 10, which focuses on Blitz and Millie. I say slight improvement because in this episode we fix up the problem from last time, which is that this time around the conflict actually makes sense. Blitz is suffering a weird breakup situationship issue, and so he's making reckless and financially irresponsible decisions. When he decides to go on a mission with Millie, he doesn't take it seriously when it's obvious that Millie does, so Millie breaks under this pressure. Despite the fact that we've never seen Millie act this way before, which I only fully realize now writing this script, good job, Spindlehorse team, pretty impressive. This conflict is set up very well. We see that IMP is in disarray, we see that Millie and Moxie are both taking it seriously, but that Millie's the only one with the stomach to do something about it, which fits in very well with what we know about her character. We see her be passively upset about it leading up to this point at several instances, which is a short form of bubbling up the tension until it explodes under pressure, which is what Truth Seekers did. We also see Blitz adding to this pressure, which is very in character of him to do. All in all, the setup is way better than Unhappy Campers, and it's generally pretty good. Here's their fighting scene.
What? I'm done. I don't want to play Ghost Hunter with you, and
it's Ghost.
I wasn't done. You know, I always love to have fun with you, and I ain't said boo to you moping around like a sad sack for weeks. But we have bills to pay. So look, you can go be pathetic and play sex ghosts if that's what you need to do, but I gotta get this job done.
Fine! Who needs you anyway? Bethany Ghost, her works alone!
This scene is good for the same reason above. The way she talks to Blitz highlights some of the things that we've already seen plenty of times about her, but also things we've only seen in this episode, but which point to an internal conflict which makes sense considering what else we know about her. Millie has money anxiety. She's at her wit's end and she's stern with him about it because she can't take it anymore. All in all, this is a very functional scene. But then they sort of mess it up. You see, if this were an episode of a normal cartoon, and or if I was writing it, I would have the characters go their separate ways, and then focus on them both individually. This lets us get to see how each of the characters responded to the conflict, and also what they think of that conflict, etc. Then the characters confront their feelings, usually with some monster of the week kind of experience, some supernatural whatever. They both realize their flaws in their thinking, and at the end of the episode they apologize to one another. It's about as cliche as it can get, but there's a reason you probably remember an episode of a show like this from your early childhood. It works. Instead, as soon as Millie leaves, we go straight into Blitz's perspective. Okay? We see his interpretation of the conflict. Okay? In a slightly overdramatic monster of the week hallucination. Okay? Which ends in him having a panic attack. Okay? And Millie? Oh yeah, it cuts to Millie and she immediately runs to comfort him. We see literally nothing about how this situation affected Millie, or even about what she thought about it afterwards. There's a vague implication that she feels guilty, which, first of all, have any of you guys ever had a friend who was pretty consistently, having undesirable or negative qualities to you, and you lightly call them out on it once, and like half an hour later they're threatening suicide over how your Chinese dog eating jokes aren't funny? Very high maintenance friends indeed. But more importantly, we don't actually know how she was feeling because we don't actually get to see it. Is she guilty? If so, why? Does she feel she's been too hard on him? Is she worried that she might make him even more reclusive? Does she just think that she should have been more professional? What is it about her? I'm begging you to give me something, anything. Just to rub even further salt in the wounds, in an attempt to console Blitz, Millie divulges into the backstory of how they met, in which we learn that Millie is violent and likes fighting. I'll add that one to the list, guys. That one's new to me. We then learn that Millie used to suffer with imposter syndrome when she first started working on IMP, which is actually pretty good. I actually really like their dialogue here, having the same positives as the argument from above, in my opinion. Some people may say its tone is a little all over the place, and yeah, that's definitely a problem with Hell of a Boss in general. But as someone who knows plenty of hicks and who lives right next to a farm, I can confidently say that this is pretty much exactly what you're gonna get if you're going to them with any kind of emotional issue. So I think it's pretty good in that way. But there's another issue with the supposed backstory. You're not off the hook yet, Vivzy. Sure, it works fine, I'm glad we get to know her better and all, but like, this conflict that they're describing is presently meaningless. Millie's imposter syndrome was a short bout she struggled with once that she got over immediately after a small and frankly stinky pep talk. And the only time it's ever mentioned again is in a scene later, which only serves to solidify how totally over it she is. She just goes back to her all good here, no problems attitude. You know, I see people in the comments being like, oh, this is so good for Millie. Finally, a Millie episode. But this is neither of those things. The only Millie depth we're afforded is something that happened so far in the past, it didn't ever get a chance to affect the plot. I hope I don't have to explain that this brings literally nothing new to the table. I guess it's something, certainly better than nothing, I guess? But this isn't the holy grail people keep saying it is, for reasons which are abundant in this video. That's not even to mention the worst offense of this video, which is that basically everything Millie-centric in this video exclusively exists for the purpose of furthering Blitz's own personal arc. Her argument with him, it leads to this hallucination scene which leads to his panic attack. Her backstory exposition, oh, it's just something for Ronaldo to torment Blitz with, relating back to his sense of worthlessness. Literally everything Millie says and does in this episode that I gave her praise for only exists for the development of another character. What an insult! I'm gonna be honest, I wouldn't even find this that big of a deal in any other cartoon. Like, plenty of cartoons have characters who, as I put it, only exist for plot convenience. I mean, think of like Cosmo and Wanda. Those two literally only exist for plot convenience, in the most direct sense. This is an effective and reasonable way to arrange your cogs for the purpose of a story, and I don't mean to deny that. But the reason this bothers me is not because it's ineffective, it bothers me because compared to the treatment Moxie has gotten thus far, this is embarrassing. In Truth Seekers, Moxie wasn't just there as extra seasoning to Blitz's angst, we saw how Blitz's actions affected Moxie's feelings. We saw a whole side of Moxie. Full extended shots of how Moxie felt and how he's interpreting the things that Blitz is doing. I'd actually go as far as to argue that in this episode, it was more focused on Moxie than it was on Blitz. After all, at the end of the episode, it is Moxie who gets the character development, which is quickly thwarted away by every episode which follows it. But this makes the fact that we never see how anything any other character does affects Millie simultaneously obvious and offensive. That's why people are so mad. A version of Hello Boss could exist, which is a lot like the Fairly Odd Parents, in which Moxie and Millie only really exist to bolster the issues Blitz is having with Stolas. I actually think that would make for a better show, considering Stolas seems to be the show's main focus at the moment. But because it's not, because they've given Moxie so much character development, it's a little telling that you can't bother to give Millie anything. I'm hesitant to say this is even a sexism problem and is instead a writing incompetency problem, but it can be both. After all, it's not just Millie who has this problem. Many of the female cast suffers with the same or similar problems in writing, especially Stella, which will have to be the subject of a whole different video at some point. Again, I don't want to imply anything about Vivian or any of the other members of the Spindlehorse team because I don't know them and I just don't think it's fair or right to. But I will say it's bonkers that this is such a prevalent problem in media that comes out of Spindlehorse. And again, while I do think that looking into your own biases as a writer is important and necessary, and I urge anyone watching to do so, I think having a better grasp of writing is arguably a better and more constructive solution to this problem. And I hope that I've demonstrated that well in this video. Feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.